Hello, I'm Neil Barker. This is the News Hour live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes. The United Nations Security Council passes a resolution calling for a temporary halt to fighting in Gaza to allow aid in.
Honestly, I think many had given up hope that we would ever speak on this conflict. But that's exactly what we just did.
Meanwhile, medical workers race to transport patients out of harm's way as Israeli forces raid Gaza's largest hospital. Dozens of premature babies inside Al-Shifa fight to survive. The White House says it did not give the okay for Israel to raid the hospital. And a meeting of world powers, US President Joe Biden sits down with Chinese President Xi Jinping in San Francisco. The UN Security Council has finally agreed to adopt a resolution that calls for, quote, extended pauses in fighting to allow much-needed humanitarian aid into Gaza. The resolution also calls for the pause to last a sufficient number of days for that aid to reach those desperately in need of it. The resolution passed with 12 votes. The US, Russia, and Britain abstained.
The world has watched with understandable frustration and increasing concern as this council has been unable to speak out on this pressing matter of international peace and security. And it was not for lack of trying. We got very close last month when the United States put forward a strong and balanced resolution that would have been adopted if not for vetoes by Russia and China. And honestly, I think many had given up hope that we would ever speak on this conflict. The world has watched with understandable frustration and increasing concern as this council has been unable to speak out on this pressing matter of international peace and security. And it was not for lack of trying.
Our amendment calling for a humanitarian truce is consistently along the lines of the aim of the stated aim of the authors of the text to preserve its purely humanitarian nature. This is the lowest common denominator, lower than which the Council simply cannot allow itself to fall, particularly against the backdrop of the monstrous humanitarian situation in Gaza and the incoming reports of the Israeli armed forces storming Al-Shifa hospital. Today, strikes were launched on 2 UNRWA schools. Our duty is to save the lives of civilians who have a lethal threat hanging over them. I hope that you all share that position.
All right, let's drill down into some of these developments and bring in William Lawrence. He's a professor of political science at the American University and a former US diplomat. He joins us from Washington, D.C. A very, very warm welcome to you. Firstly, your analysis on what we've seen play out at the UN Security Council there. I mean, this, in terms of humanitarian supplies finally reaching those desperately in need of it, is a positive step forward, but much, much more needs to be done, surely.
Well, I think you answered the question. I mean, the diplomacy of it is important, but on the humanitarian side, it's woefully insufficient. But if I can go to the diplomacy side for a minute, you know, we had the various resolutions previously that were vetoed by one permanent five-member or another because they weren't harsh on this issue or that issue, and that made the UN Security Council, it made itself irrelevant. And then, of course, because the resolutions are non-binding, the General Assembly was irrelevant. And here, finally, we have consensus that the fighting has to stop. And whether it's for 4 hours, which the Israelis said they would agree to, once per day, or if it's for 3 days, or whatever the short period is, with one child being killed every 6 minutes, we're talking about children's lives being saved, elderly, the sick, and all of those civilians bombed on a daily basis. And so, any stop in the fighting is progress. But we have a long, long way to go before the legitimate rights of the civilian population of Palestine is met. As you know, the blockade of food, water, internet, electricity, fuel, all that is illegal under international law, as is the bombing. And so we have a long way to go.
Of course, resolutions like this trip up immediately over the question of enforcement, of implementation. I mean, how is it possible to strong-arm Israel into abiding by these decisions?
Because the U.S. voted for it. As you know, the U.S. is often vetoing or voting against these motions. And it with some difficulty, reached this new position that the U.S. was in favor of pausing. And now that the U.S. is in favor of pausing and has the international community 100% behind at least pausing, it can go to Israel and say, our arms are tied, you have to stop. And don't forget, the U.S. is arming Israel, it's paying in many ways for what's going on, and it's not applying U.S. law, which restricts how weapons can be used, etc.
I mean, forgive me, but the U.S. abstained in this vote. It didn't vote for it. I mean, it's hardly overwhelming tacit support for what the UN's been trying to achieve here in this resolution.
Yeah, but it's not against pauses, and it can implement it. It's against the insufficient language towards Hamas. And I have to say that is a problem. I mean, I really believe that anyone violating international law, whether it's Israel or Hamas, needs to be called out in these resolutions. The UN has not been doing that, and if they had that language, and I bet the U.S. Could have voted for it. But now that we have a 12-0 Security Council resolution for humanitarian pauses, which is also the U.S. policy, there can be forward motion to save lives.
To what extent is this move by the United States an indication that time is running out when it comes to ongoing support for Israel? Over the past few days, we've seen the language start to soften, an attempt perhaps to contain Israel. I mean, is that bearing any fruit on the ground, do you think?
Well, even Israeli analysts are saying publicly and privately that they think they have 2 to 3 more weeks. That's very different from all the talk about a 6-month war or a 2-year war or whatever at the beginning of this conflict to totally eradicate Hamas from the face of the earth. And we're beginning to move in the direction of where we were in 2021 when the U.S. was able to hold Israel to a 3-week war when they wanted a 3-month war. And so, anything that happens in terms of pressure within the United States from the Arab and Muslim population and the new generation of Jewish Americans, they're all against this war. And any pressure from the outside, whether the UN and other international bodies and just bilateral pressure, that's all good. And when the U.S. government hears loud and clear, they can start pushing Israel harder.
We are, it seems, starting to at least dare to imagine what life might be like when all of this hopefully comes to an end sooner or later. What is clear is that when it is all over, there needs to be a massive global coalition behind working out what happens next, rather than simply leaving this to the Israelis, the Palestinians, and indeed the U.S.
Well, there are huge, daunting projects at hand, as you suggested. Number one, we need a 2-state solution to be rejuvenated, and often good can come out of catastrophe. We also, 45% of the buildings were damaged or flattened in Gaza, and most of the infrastructure is gone. And so rebuilding Gaza will be a multi-year project. I mean, one of the ironies of the U.S. support for Israel is that, and I've been in meetings when I was in the U.S. government, is U.S. officials getting mad at other U.S. officials when buildings we spent millions of dollars building get bombed by Israel and flattened, and then we have to build the building again, whether a hospital or, an electric build, a company or a youth center or university building. So this is just an unsustainable situation we have with Israel, thinking that there's only military solutions to its problems, and hopefully we'll restart a diplomatic process after this is over.
Right, unsustainable cycle of violence. William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science at the American University and former US diplomat. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure.
Now, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN says Israel's already rejected the resolution.
The resolution did not condemn the killing by Israel of 11,000 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, including 5,000 Palestinian children. Let me repeat, 5,000 Palestinian children. It did not condemn the indiscriminate attacks by Israel. It did not condemn the assault on hospitals and schools. It did not condemn the killing by Israel of UN staff, journalists, humanitarian personnel, doctors, rescue teams. It does not condemn the arbitrary imprisonment of thousands of Palestinians, men, women, and children, nor call for their immediate and unconditional release.
Well, Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor James Bays says Israel repeatedly breaks UN Security Council resolutions.
Well, that was a call for a ceasefire, and the US has made it clear that a permanent ceasefire is something that it would block. And so I think the other countries that voted against it because it knew that that